Hello, welcome to Maritain Musings, a project of the American Maritain Association. I'm Dr. Matthew Minard, and I'm here today with Dr. Anna Siljak, an associate professor of the humanities at the Hamilton School for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. We're going to be talking today about a recent text that was published in English. For those of you who are at least online, well, not just online, but on YouTube, you'll see it's a series of correspondence between Nikolai Berdyaev and Jacques Maritain, or Jacques Pavlovich, as we'll see eventually, between the 1920s and the 40s. It's effectively a combination of both their correspondence and a rather lengthy history of their interactions in the Parisian scene. And so the English edition was edited by Dr. Siljak, and we're very pleased to have you here today to discuss this text. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate talking to you.
So we're going to have to probably do two introductory bits for our listeners, I think, here today. There's going to be the book itself and then Berdyaev. We're going to need to do a little bit of each. So can you just begin a little bit by telling us, a little bit about yourself as relevant to this project, and then about your work on this recent text, published with, you can probably even say, I'm trying to remember.
McGill Queens.
Yeah, it's McGill Queens Press.
up in Canada.
Yeah. So go ahead. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, why you did this, what the text is, and then I'll do an intro to get you to tell us about Berdyaev himself first. But go ahead.
Yeah, that's great. So I began working on Berdyaev in a kind of circuitous way. I started off with a much bigger project, which I will someday still finish, on what's known as the Silver Age of Russian culture. I like to call it the Russian Renaissance. Very short period of time, 1890 to about 1917, there was this real explosion of Russian cultural development, and that's where you get the Russian ballet and Russian painting and Russian music, all of the familiar stuff that we encounter. And in the process of doing this, I realized that there was a whole philosophical component to this Renaissance that was not entirely unrelated from the bigger project that the Renaissance encompassed. And there I discovered Nikolai Berdyaev, and I became especially intrigued by his sort of underappreciated philosophical attempts to re-engage the Christian tradition with secular modernity. In particular, I was spurred to write about him, and this will be relevant for our conversation about Maritain. I had read Samuel Moyn's books on human rights, and he had spoken quite a bit. He actually, I think, revived Maritain scholarship in a way by arguing that human rights, international human rights, were not a product of some Lockean Millian tradition, but rather a Catholic personalist project of the interwar period of the 20th century. And in one of his books, I can't remember if it was Christian Human Rights, it may have been, he mentions that Maritain had been influenced by a particular Russian version of personalism brought into France by Nikolai Berdyaev. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. What does this mean? How did Berdyaev view rights? Russia is not a country that's known, I think, in the popular imagination as a country that developed a robust theory of human rights. And yet there it was. And I think Berdyaev is not the only one who did this. But he certainly was, I would argue, the most popular philosopher in the West. And he was the popular Russian philosopher in the West in the interwar period. And he was the one who engaged with a lot of the French theologians and philosophers, including Jacques Maritain. So I began to write a book on Berdyaev, which I hope will be done very soon. And in the process, also discovered this correspondence. Now, full disclosure, I discovered the correspondence on my own, but a lot of other people did as well. And so the author of Exceptional Dialogue, whom I translated, Bernard Joubert, published this correspondence in French. And I edited and had translated this correspondence. I thought it was very interesting, especially since Maritain had been mentioned as this Catholic personalist philosopher that helped to design UN Human Declaration on Human Rights. Um, I thought it was useful to see this kind of connection between him and the Russian world.
Yeah, so I've got other thoughts. Like I inject myself on this thing, but
No, that's great.
at the end though, I'm gonna wait till the end because being an
Okay.
Eastern Catholic
No,
myself,
absolutely.
I've got some questions about kind of Berdyaev and in sort of the both his context then and sort of the Orthodox mind of that like 30s,
Yes.
40s
Yes.
changes that occur kind of around Bulgakov and others and the controversies.
Yes. Yeah, oh, yes. 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 We can talk about
And I'm gonna have to ask that question at the end. But um yeah, I think it's probably best if we move toward, like, just you providing now a little bit of a just a bit more background on both, I mean, just the general biography of Berdyaev, just sort of, you know, where he was and how he got where he was, as well as the influences on him. Um, and I think it's important to then show, well, why is there something about Maritain's quote unquote personalism that is, deepened, like, an understanding of it by seeing the vein of, like, those intellectual, veins that are coming from Berdyaev. I mean, what is it that's unique about, basically that Russian context? Which I'll be honest, sometimes I myself have probably under the influence of certain, the sort of neo-patristic, reaction to
Yes.
Bulgakov.
Yes. Hmm.
I've dismissed some of the 19th century and early 20th century Russians as effectively it's warmed over Hegelianism.
Yeah.
Right?
No,
And to
you
me
hear that all the time. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I'm sure you do. This text has convinced me not to do that, and I've ordered some texts by Berdyaev, to be
Oh,
less
good. That's always good to hear.
ignorant. Yeah, to be
Yep.
less ignorant. I think that's a good thing. Um but I think it's important for our listeners to realize this too, because there's a certain narrative, and I think it pops up every so often about Maritain as well, right? His personalism is the mark of just this, modernizing tendency in him that effectively gradually moves him away from his Thomism into, sort of a uh, intra-war and especially like post-war stage of his thought where he becomes more questionable to orthodox, like little o orthodox thinkers, to the powers that be in Rome. And I've at times tried to minimalize quote unquote personalism in Maritain's thought because I feel people miss that he never loses the Thomism, right? I think
No,
there's an
no.
organic
I think,
evolution.
I mean, for Maritain, full disclosure, not a Maritain scholar, but my sense is that and in fact, when he debates with Berdyaev, you can see
Mhm.
that coming through quite strongly.
You
Like
do,
he is a
exactly.
Thomist,
Exactly. He doesn't
and
give ground on certain points, even
no,
where
no,
he's
no, he absolutely, yeah,
deepening his thought in this
yeah,
dialogue. It's very clear sometimes,
yeah,
especially like you get that again, even not just in the letters, but then in this wonderful account that you get all the sense of the meetings that are behind those letters. Because sometimes the letters sound like, hey, can we meet these days, or we're going to have this.
yeah. Yeah,
So there's,
full disclosure on the book, I should say that because I think I sometimes worry people will be disappointed. The book's value is not so much in the letters themselves as philosophical texts, right? So sometimes you get really, really in-depth philosophical conversations. Like if you think of Heidegger's correspondence or Leo Strauss's correspondence, you really
or
get,
Maritain with Journet, Maritain with
or Maritain with
Simone, those
Journée.
sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is unfortunately, and there is a question of how many of these letters got preserved and how many got lost. So there is that question. What's more intriguing to me about this collection is, and first of all, Bernard Joubert did a marvelous job of this. So say,
Mhm.
pairing the letters with the memoirs and saying, okay, here are all the people, here are the players on this.
Yes.
Here
Is
are the ecumenical conversations that are going on. Here are the people who are participating in them. Here's what some of the controversy is regarding Berdyaev and Russian thought and Orthodoxy and Catholicism, right?
mhm,
So it's not the letters as philosophical texts, but letters as evidence of an
mhm.
interpenetration of two traditions that I would argue prior to this really did not communicate in a robust fashion as they did
No,
in this.
correct. Correct, because you see it in the difference. It even came through at one point in the essay. There's something between, Maritain and Journet
Yes,
about
about
the account on
Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky,
Yes,
exactly.
yes,
And
yes,
Maritain
yes.
is telling Journet sort of to back off and be easier on Berdyaev. And even in Journet's case, he says at one point, and Joubert pulls that out, I guess, in the letters. He says, "Listen, I'm a Swiss. I'm thinking in terms of basically Calvinism, right? Like my
Yes, yes,
interpretive
yes,
way,
yes, yes.
right? It's
And
a
that happens
non-issue." Yeah.
Yeah, when you read the correspondence with the French and they sometimes they don't know where to place the Orthodox because, they are so used to dialogue with Protestantism,
Yeah.
right? So every time Berdyaev says something like, well, where does that fit in the Protestant Catholic
Yeah.
conversation? And of
As
course,
an Eastern
it's the
as an
third
Eastern
thing.
Catholic, I can just
Yeah.
say I feel this. That's where we're stuck, is, like, not being understood. So, anyway, this gives a good context. I mean, it's just to really emphasize to people, that intro essay is, as much as you flip through the letters and may think, "Well, what's in the letters?" That intro essay, it does a
Yeah.
lot of lifting. I don't even call it
Yes.
half the
Yes.
book.
Yes.
So
And I see it as a reference book too, in a way,
yes.
right? So
Yeah.
if people are looking to find out who are the ecumenical, who participated in these ecumenical
Yeah.
conversations, then get this
Yeah, and
book.
it helps to fill out the idea too, because you tend to think of just the Fourier Jesuits who are present. You see some of that
Yeah, yeah,
certain
yeah, yeah.
group
You
around
see
them
them.
here,
Yeah, yeah.
but you miss also then you see Maritain is such an interesting guy because he ends up not being completely in any camp, even if he's a bit more of a retrograde Thomist. But let's actually tell our people, like, they're thinking, so they're talking about meetings between people that we know very little
No, nothing about.
except about
Yeah.
the time that
Yep.
Berdyaev wrote. So just tell a little bit about, I mean, you probably have to give a little bit of biography just so people have an understanding of, how he gets trained and how he gets into, the Francophone scene. And then just basics of just outlining his thought projects because he's got his hands in there are a couple different domains if you look across his pretty big bibliography.
Yes. So I think the best way to start with Berdyaev is that one has to understand that by the time he got to Paris and met Maritain, he had already, I mean, he was 50 years old, right? So he had already developed a very coherent and really, I would almost argue almost the entirety of his philosophical system and theological, although he didn't call himself a theologian, but his philosophical system prior to emigration. And he did so in an interesting way. And that's why I was moved to write a book about him, is that you can't really write a book about Berdyaev's philosophy without talking about his philosophical journey, right? So he starts as a Marxist. He actually participates in protests. He talks about it being one of the most exciting times in his life, goes into exile. But as he's in exile and he's doing a bunch of reading, and he was a very well-read young man. I think he bragged that he read Kant at 13. He reads more and more into Marxism, and he becomes increasingly disillusioned with the Marxist project. Much about Marx he finds very compelling. I think Marx's understanding of the modern technological capitalist world is one that really resonates with him. But he becomes both philosophically and spiritually disillusioned with Marxism. And I think this becomes important because it sets the foundation for his future philosophy. On the one hand, Marx's philosophical materialism, that is his argument that the world is only composed of matter and that causality lives in the material world, and that economics determines human life. Um, for Berdyaev, there's a contradiction between that and the revolutionary project, right? So if we're all conditioned by our neurons and by the economic situation that we're in, where does change come from? And Marx is very elaborate about how he thinks it can be possible, but for Berdyaev, this is impossible. And that's where he begins to develop this idea that any ethics, that really revolution is actually ethics, right? So ethics poses that the world as it is and the world as it is should be are two very different things. You can see some Kant in this. Is and ought are two very separate things. And that's what Marxism lacks. Where does the ought come from? Where should things be better? How do we know that things should be better? So that's the first disillusionment. And the second one is a spiritual one. He has this great conversation when he talks about his move out of Marxism, where he says, where's the room for tragedy in Marxism? Right? So there's this sense that even if we were to make the world perfectly Marxist, we would all still die. We would all be aware of our mortality. We would all want answers to the question of, who are we as people? What is our spiritual dimension? Is there a world after this? And there, Marx is entirely silent for his own philosophical reasons. And so I talk about freedom and tragedy in my first chapter on Berdyaev because I think he wants the freedom. He sees that Marx has something about freedom and freedom from economic necessity but he doesn't understand tragedy and the tragedy of human life and what our expectation is. So that's where the journey begins. And then he begins reading a bunch of stuff, and he reads everything. He reads the Kabbalah. That is part of what made this project so difficult, because he reads the Kabbalah, he reads Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy. He writes all these letters on how he struggles with anthroposophy and theosophy. Reads the patristics, so we'll get to that if we want to, about Florovsky and Berdyaev and patristic thought. And he really, in a gradual process, I won't go into the whole thing, he returns to his Orthodox roots, albeit through a circuitous way. And when he talks about the Orthodox tradition, he does so using some of the language he gets from the Kabbalah, the patristics, Steiner, Marx, even, right? And he's not alone in this. Bulgakov, I think you can see that in Bulgakov as well. Sergei Bulgakov, the theologian who is his best friend. You can see it in Lev Shestov, the Jewish philosopher, right? They all share this way of engaging with secular modern philosophy, or just modern philosophy in general, by trying to look at it from a different perspective. Okay, so he eventually returns to Orthodoxy. It's hard to know. It is hard to say. He didn't have a major reconversion experience or anything. It's just over time, you can see his work is becoming more and more Christian, at least, and I think more and more Orthodox.
Why do you
So,
say you think? What was that last qualifier?
well, I think more and more Orthodox. Again, it's. We'll get to the contradiction. But I wrote a marvelous piece at the beginning of, I forget which book, where he says, on the contradictions in my own thought. And I mean, basically the essay was written saying, yeah, there are contradictions. You're just going to have to live with it.
Okay,
I'm just a living human being that contradicts himself.
sure.
So, so
Quickly.
there are times at which he will say things that, at least, and this is a lot of Orthodox theologians fault him for this, because he will say things that in the modern Orthodox world seem very anti-Orthodox. He had a terrible experience in a monastery and thought spiritual fatherhood was not for him.
Mhm.
That kind of thing.
Sure.
He read the Philokalia and sensed in this the enormous degradation of man. That's tough. That's tough for an Orthodox
Sure.
to
It's going to be a big project to try and keep
yeah.
your mind from being totally disharmonious with that. Yeah.
Yes. But I will, so again, probably
Sure.
not in this podcast, hopefully in the book, we can talk about how this is actually essentially Orthodox in many ways,
Sure. Sure. That's fine.
as distinct from Catholic and Protestant, and also not secular.
Yeah.
And what I was thinking of doing is maybe giving you 3 or 4 major points, major sort of innovative philosophical contributions, I think,
Mhm.
Berdyaev made. Is that sort of where we want to go with this right now? So I can talk about 3 or 4
Ye-
very interesting sort of perspectives on religion and secular modernity that Berdyaev's philosophy brings up, and then you can ask questions about all of that. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
That's good. And then after you do that, help people then just sort of understand super high level how he's then present in the Parisian scene. They can buy the
Yeah.
book, all the details. So,
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what he brought with him into France.
mhm.
Right. So this is the philosophy that he had as he moved into the French context. And then I can talk about how that then becomes interesting, but also problematic for the French
Great.
theological
Yep.
philosophical scene.
Yeah. And then if you can just sort of hint at, without worrying about all the details, what some of those intersecting circles are then, like what his
Okay. So,
French
I mean, I
influence.
think the main thing that he brings to when he comes to France, he brings something he calls because he's called repeatedly his anthropodicy. So not a theodicy, but an anthropodicy, which is the justification of man before God, is how he calls it. And he argues that both the Christian and the secular traditions have lost the sense of human value. He wrote a book which became very popular in France called The End of the Renaissance, in which he argued that Renaissance humanism is dead in the secular world. And he argued that that's what had to be regained, was humanism. And so one of the major points he makes, and he does this in dialogue with a Russian, Orthodox Russian philosophical tradition the theology of which goes all the way back, which is the theology of divine humanity, that human beings are part divine and part human. They were created by God to be the mediators between God and his creation. And that for this reason, they are, and Berdyaev uses the term, an aristocracy, right? Humanity is the aristocracy. It is of the highest value. Every living human being is created in the image and likeness of God. And for that reason, every living human being has unconditional value. The fall obviously undermines this, right? And he talks about fallenness, and he talks about the confusion human beings have about the fallen world versus God's intention for man, right? So if we talk about necessity, as Marx does, if we talk about evolution, as Darwin does, right, we're talking about a fallen world in which there's a struggle for existence, competition for survival. But to see this at all as all there is the fundamental mistake that secular modernity makes. Because we know, and this is one of my favorite parts of Berdyaev, he says, if we look deep down, we know that's not true. Right? We know we were meant for something more than just a struggle to survive, right? We know we were designed for a higher purpose. And it's accessing that sense of divinity that I think is one of the starting projects of. So divine humanity was Vladimir Solovyov's term, but he definitely uses that in that context. And then the most controversial one, and I think if you read this in the book, I think it's one of the more amusing things, divine nothingness. So for Berdyaev, and he articulated this both pre-immigration and post-immigration, God is no thing, nothing, right? God is at root, and he uses German mystical theology. I mean, again, this gets very crazy, but he uses German mystical theology. God emerges out of the Ungrund, which is the groundlessness, the swirling kind of potential groundlessness out of which God creates the world. And it's this chaos or nothingness that's at the heart of God that does multiple things for Berdyaev's philosophy, but obviously is extremely controversial. The first, and I think most obvious one, is that God has to be no thing. He does have patristic justification for this, right?
Mhm.
If you think about Pseudo-Dionysius, who's one of my favorite patristic authors, right? God cannot be a thing. He's simply no thing. I mean, he is also existent, but also non-existent, because God created everything that exists, right? So there's a way in which it's an exercise in avoiding idolatry, right? So because if God is a thing, he's a human-like creature that's really big and large and super powerful, then we've missed the point about what
Mhm.
God is, right? We worship an idol. Basically, he says, man creates God in his own image, right? So we
Mhm.
create this idol. The way to get away from that is this idea of divine nothingness, right? That there is this groundlessness, non-existence at the heart of God. The second thing it allows is for radical freedom. So where does God meet man? He meets man in the ungrund, in the groundlessness, right? So I am totally free to either move towards God or away from God. God does not overcome that or constrain that, right? So there's this radical freedom, the human being. And finally, and this is again his contribution to definitely Russian philosophy, but I would argue Western philosophy as well. Creativity can only happen out of nothing, right?
Mhm.
We, like God, and again, he has some patristic basis for this, right? We, like God, can create out of nothing because we are created in the image and likeness of God.
Mhm.
Creativity then becomes this amazing philosophical principle for Berdyaev because, and Sergei Bulgakov has this as well, and I talk about this in my book. We are called to be co-creators with God. And this is what's called theurgy in the Russian religious philosophical tradition, right? Co-creation together with God. The world is fallen. It's a world of dead things. And we as human beings are called to make it alive again, right? Now, the most obvious instance is art. We can see this most obviously in art, but they didn't limit it to art. I mean, they talked about agriculture. They talked about economics. So that's the divine um, uh, the divine nothingness and its potential. And then the last thing, there are two more things. One, very briefly, but we can expand on it if you want to. For Berdyaev, Bulgakov, and all others, the person and the individual, and we can talk about this in relation to Maritain as well. The
Hmm.
person is not the individual. Individualism is a modern construct, which makes the individual a self-enclosed monad, which interacts with the world often through conflict. Like if you look at Hegel, right, the master-slave dialectic, I want to appropriate the world. There are obstacles in the name of other people, and then I have to project violence in order to overcome and get recognition. The person, by contrast, for the religious philosophical world, is always constituted in relation. So you cannot be a person without other people. We can, if we want to get super controversial, we could talk about their view on gender in this regard, which is that they had a very Neoplatonic understanding of gender as dividedness, right? That the very fact that we are male and female points out to us that we are always lacking another in order to be whole. Right. So persons can only develop interpersonally. We can develop how that relates to community and the church if you want to, but I don't want to get this too far
I
out because I want to get to the last point, which is church and state. And here he also is very radical, extremely radical. He argues that the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Caesar, you can see where the Catholics are really going to struggle with this one.
Mhm.
Right? The kingdom of God is not the kingdom of Caesar, and that church and state must be radically separated. For him, the church has no authority in the world, right? I got into a big debate about it with a person on integralism and, right? The church has no authority. The church is a fully free community into which people enter and from which they can leave freely. The only authority in the world is the state. The state is necessary. It's a necessity. The world has fallen. We have to keep people from killing each other. But outside of this strict necessitarian worldview, the state cannot do good, right? It's something that I find fascinating in its radicalism, right? For Berdyaev, by the way, the state can't even protect rights. The state will not protect rights. The state, it's the violator of rights. And so every time you try to get the state to guarantee your rights, it's going to violate them by necessity. He believed that if the church remained outside the state, it could become the guarantor of rights. So that's quite a not modern understanding of what the role of the church is. But he
Mhm.
did believe that rights were divinely inspired. I mean, divinely given, access the roots of the sort of spiritual in man. And we'll talk about liberalism later, I think, but that's where he saw potential for liberalism, was this acknowledgement of rights as the access to the spiritual in man.
There's okay, you have just a little bit more because there's the last. That's all. Go ahead, though.
No, all I'm going to say is that he develops all of this prior to emigration. 1917 happens, the revolution. He continues to teach in various philosophical settings. But by 1920, Dzerzhinsky and the whole security apparatus is onto him. He gets called in by the security services, interviewed. He's characteristic. He says, let me tell you what I think about communism. And I have this letter that he wrote to the secret police where he was like, here are the things that I like about it. And here are the things that I don't, whatever. He's just completely honest. Anyway, they got tired of him and a bunch of other philosophers, and they sent them all on what's called in our history, the philosophy steamers. Right. So there's these ships. They were told to pack their bags. They had about a week to do it, gather up all their stuff, no books or very few books, and gone on these philosophy steamers, ended up in Germany in 1922. Found it difficult to live in Germany, given all the economic and political situations there. And so many of them then end up in Paris in 1924, helped by the YMCA organization to settle there. And that's where Berdyaev ends up in 1924, and that's where he lives until he dies in 1948.
There's a lot. I mean, I've got notes upon notes on each one of those topics because they have a relevance. I mean, each one of them has a relevance for today. I find it amusing. I almost interrupted you. The the thing that was controversial was gender and not Jacques and the Urgrund. I
Well, it
just
depends when. I think
I know. I understand.
back
I was
then, the Ungrind was far more controversial
Yes.
than the
Yeah,
gender.
the gender. I do understand. I understand where we have to,
Yeah.
but the questions of theosophy, theurgy, all that's very current today because there are a number of things sort of in the spiritual context. I mean, there are a number of thinkers, kind of popular public intellectuals who are sort of playing with these same themes, sometimes with direct drawing on Russian sources. I think too, I mean, there's things to be said about kind of the tragic issue the issue of tragedy is constitutive of the human condition. That is just as relevant today in face of transhumanism, which is just a different version of a kind of millenarianism that's built into Marxist thought. I mean, so anyway, my way of saying that just on his own, there's a currency here. We're sort of still living in the exact same series of issues. I want to keep moving us along because I think, well, this is going to be too interesting for me on multiple levels. I'm saying that not to just butter you up. Um, as one point of reference here, in case we have any technical issue, I paused for a little bit. You just keep going because the recording is local. And so the system will fix all that at the end.
Okay,
So you
great.
probably didn't
Yeah,
even
sure,
notice
sure,
it.
sure.
So just letting you know that happened on my end, but we'll be fine. It shouldn't cause an issue. So, yeah, I guess I'm gonna briefly, just admit that it actually is the Urgrund that drew me in. As I was reading the volume, I mean, it's the one letter that really gets big too by Maritain because it's this fight that happens at one of the meetings among, Russian émigré and Parisian figures over spiritual theology, where Maritain gets kind of worked up. Right, but it's interesting that these 2 men, um, they're, married but without children, they're kind of wedded well, they have an interesting background. Maritain starts as a kind of member of the left in his
That's
own
right. That's right.
upbringing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's his story with Action Française, etcetera. But, there's he's never a pure philosopher then either. Whenever he comes back,
No.
he's always imbued with the same kind of mysticism in the background, right? Which then affects his concept of the human person, etcetera. And so this this stuff on effectively the echoes of I see it as like echoes of theosophy, um, coming through and with regard to here, for instance, this from Jakob Burma, the Urgerin stuff. Draws me in more to just the fact that this whole movement of personalism is not abstractable from these questions of spiritual theology. And it's interesting to see that this is part of the dialogue, right? Like an important part of those meetings they would gather in were not just a bunch of people talking about the political issues of the intra-war world. It's deeply connected. The anthropology is deeply connected to these questions of spirituality. Um, so you may want to make a remark there or not, because I think it's important for people to realize that because there's a certain sense in which people have still a I don't know how to put it a kind of kitchen table view of what personalism is a kind of humanism, and it's something much deeper. You've already hinted at it, so I'm actually just asking you probably to wrap that bow so that people understand that that's part of this dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, it for sure, if you look at sort of the conversations that are happening at that time period. So personalism, um, in the introduction to this book that I'm writing, talk about it as like starting small. There's almost a sense in which, um, you've been through the Enlightenment, you've been through Marxism, you've been through leftism. You look at Jacques and Maritain, who have this suicide pact because they
Mhm.
cannot see the meaning of human existence. Then they go to Bergson's lectures, and suddenly a whole new world's open to them. This real sense that humanism is dying. That's where Berdyaev bursts onto the French scene because he publishes a book called The New Middle Ages,
Mm.
which basically argues that point that the Renaissance is over. It's like the fall of Rome. He kind of weirdly mixes those two together. Humanism is gone. Uh, the world of mechanical reproduction of techno capitalism, of industrialization is upon us, and it's dehumanizing, right? So the question then becomes, and for them, for Maritain as well, I think, ideologies like utilitarianism, I mean, philosophies like utilitarianism, other philosophies are deeply unsatisfying because they stay on the superficial level. So I talk about it like starting small, which is not really starting small because, of course, they make big conclusions, but like, what is the human person? And for them, this wasn't just a political question or even really a kind of abstract philosophical question, right? It is what makes me a human being and how do I relate to the world and to other people in this universe, which is now devoid of enchantment,
Yeah,
uh,
it's a
highly
cosmic
mechanized.
question.
Yeah.
Continue because
And ultimately, like, you can see it informs their politics, but I think because the presuppositions have been so strongly laid out. So, for instance, you see their reaction to fascism, to communism, to anti-Semitism, right? And you say, well, or even, and I mean, this becomes very controversial depending on where you are in the modern Catholic right, but to Franco, right? They see all of this as part and parcel of the thing that they described, which is the dehumanization of man and the yearning for meaning. And for them, the only exit was to truly understand who you are and how you relate to other people in the very basic, essential, microcosmic way.
yeah, good. That's I mean, you basically have we've covered what I wanted. If you, we have initial questions through our fourth, you've put us right at what I think is very relevant here. And I just want you to actually help think through this. So, from the perspective of a thinker who was influential on Maritain's own sort of work as he moves toward the period, he moves through. Actually, it's interesting. I never thought of this. This tracks very well with that move out of L'Action Française. I
Yes,
can't believe I didn't even
absolutely.
think of. I
And
mean,
I
I
make
thought of
that
it in the
parallel. Yeah.
30s, but it's 1925. They start. Their condemnation is there. I think 27 should know that. But the condemnation occurs. You have the primacy of the spiritual, which still kind of feels. It's like looking backwards, right? It's not the same yet as what integral humanism is going to have, a decade later. Um, and I mean, how to put it? You bring up and you don't have to worry about stepping on the landmines, like big integralist landmines. I can't tell where you think you're worried. You don't have much to worry about. I'm a homeless man. I'm more along Maritain and Jouret's line than anything else personally. Um, but I was thinking as I read this that there's a thread. So just let me have enough context to make sure I direct the question.
Mhm.
That's all. I think for our listeners who are going to have this Maritain interest, to see why I'm asking. It's not just I'm interested in the Russians or something. This is not a bad thing. It's just for that's a different podcast. We've got to have the Maritain.
Right.
Um, right. He begins kind of famously with, I think, money that's connected, or at least publication contacts connected with L'Action Française, the right wing reactionary monarchist movement with Charles Marat, et cetera. His book Anti-Moderne, which he in his late life he says, still I hold it all, but should have maybe not pricked people the way I did as a playful young man. Um, there's a sense in which, of course, for exactly the reasons you point out, that depending on how you trace the lines of history, that personalism is its own anti-modernism. Because
Oh, yeah. No, it's
I don't know the genealogy that Berdyaev gives for, the New Middle Ages. You can push back. I mean, the Renaissance, in a sense, the humanism of the Renaissance, in a sense, ends even earlier as kind of the technical mastery of the world is kind of baked into this other side of what's going on in the modern period, right? And so, it's interesting when you think it's like new ideas are often like old ones in new form. And I playfully think it would be fun to tell the post-liberals of today that they're intellectually close to personally. Because I know, especially Pat Deneen and others, right? They even have kind of adjuncted themselves. Now, that's a gentler version in some ways, to be honest. I mean, maybe or maybe not. But they've adjuncted themselves to certain accounts within the Thomist fold that are anti-Maritain because of the controversies of the common good and personalism that occurred in the
yes, yes, I know
Canadian.
that. Yeah, yeah.
So they would find it very strange to say, in the end, there's a certain romanticism in today's political reaction, which is in
Oh,
fact
yes.
as romantic. It has more in line with the kind of personalism than you would even agree. It's just a kind of right. personalism. It's sort of a conservative personalism. I mean, how to put it? I'm not trying to make bad references for poor Berdyaev here. I think it's a fundamental
Well, okay,
impulse.
so
Like, you see
I've
what I'm
done a
saying?
lot of
I think Demestra is not Berdyaev, obviously, like quite
no,
obviously, and yet
no.
there's kind of a correct anti-modern reaction and a problematic one, and so Berdyaev has something to say to us in our own current reactions against the technical situation we find ourselves in. That's all I'm trying to get at. I'm just trying to show you where my meandering mind is going. So maybe you respond to that.
I mean, what's interesting about the Action Française, because I read a little bit about this, and it's actually a really interesting moment in Berdyaev, Maritain's. So you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a scholar, but it's a really interesting moment in his philosophical development, in that he's attracted to them because they are anti-modernist, right? But how are they anti-modernist, right? Maras, I don't know.
But yeah.
Marat, he strangely sort of, for him, the church is an appendage of culture, right? It's not um it's not the authority. And right, this is where that comes out with the controversy over the Pope's response to that. He says, this has no authority for me, right? The church is not the primary thing. The state is the primary thing, right? So you see where I think Maritain is, for the first time, confronted with some of the dead ends that he had been working towards, right? That he was, and Rais actually writes about someone else who was Action Française. She said, in his anti-modernism, he ended up allying with people that he wouldn't have normally. So I find that, I find that,
Just keep going. Keep going.
sorry. Okay. All right. And Berdyaev, funny enough, goes through a very similar thing. So during World War I, he starts to have these he publishes a whole series of kind of Russian messianic articles where he says, Russian culture is on the ascendant. They have to fight Germanic culture, and this is a war for civilization and all the rest of it. And then afterwards, the revolution happens and the whole thing falls apart. And there goes Russian messianic hopes and dreams. And he has to confront this idea of why he was so attracted to that. And where did he go wrong? And I think for both of them, what they started to recognize was that they were looking for refuge in the wrong places, right? The natural refuge is to say the world has gone to pot. And really what we need to do, we need a strong state to come in and just clean things up a lot, right? We need and they both went through that phase, and then they both recognized that was the dead end, that there's this inability. And for Berdyaev, he was quite clear. This is the temptation of the Grand Inquisitor, right? That you can
Mhm.
solve people's problems if you control them from without. And to me, that's the realization that I think kind of both of them had. So I did a lot of reading of Deneen and some of the other integralists, and one of the things that seems to be a common theme among them is this real suspicion of individual freedom. For them, obviously, individualism, I get it, has gone too far. This is post-Enlightenment decline into a kind of radical, and Deneen's point, which I guess now he's modifying a bit, but that liberalism inevitably leads to this kind of fragmentation
Mhm.
and decadence and decay. And it basically falls apart of its own weight. I think I don't necessarily want to polemicize right now, but again, personalism to me is an antidote to that worldview, right? In other words, it's not, and Berdyaev was quite clear on this, it's not liberalism that's the problem, right? Because liberalism does have, and he's very adamant about this, liberalism has a religious core. He even calls it a Christian core. Liberalism is a Christian political philosophy. That we have lost the Christian aspect of it is, in fact, modernity's loss. But that in and of itself it has, I think, this is the conclusion I make, although Berdyaev didn't explicitly say it quite like this, but that it has the potential to regenerate if we understand the essential personalist principles at the heart of it. So, how we do that, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a political theorist, but there is that sense of regaining it. If I may, and maybe people will get mad at me for this, but I think Denis maybe is suffering from that same insufficient anthropology,
Hmm.
um, that I think Maritain and Berdyaev, whatever their faults, and they had many, um, saw, right?
Hmm.
That freedom is the essence of the human person. The freedom to accept or deny God is an essential freedom. And that
Hmm.
is the only relationship with God is in freedom. And there is no institution that can coerce us into or prevent us from leaving um, God's presence.
Yeah, this is in Maritain. Of course, he'll soften some of the anthropological claims of like freedom itself as being central. But he makes this point. He actually draws it. This is typical Maritain. He draws it out of John of St. Thomas.
Of
Jonathan
course.
Thomas are and, interestingly, Garrigou Lagrange, what a conflicted man Father Garrigou was,
Yes, he
makes the
was.
same point actually
Yes.
in a
Yes.
text
What?
that's sort of about the limitations of the power of the state, actually. So it's very interesting to see where he's even in the midst of action being taken against Maritain, yet taking up positions from the tradition in a way that he's taking it from Maritain, because on some of the common good stuff, he actually is fine with it. He edits Maritain's stuff even while they're fighting in the 40s. It's interesting. But John of St. Thomas, again, the Thomist line in general against the Scotists basically argues very profoundly that the free acts, basically acts of cognition and willing of spiritual beings who are persons, are above the entire universe.
Yes. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And it's,
That's right.
it's this interesting thing that's intrascholastic. This is typical Maritain. He then takes this and applies it here to make this point that whatever the political community is, it has to sort of reflect this capacity of the human person to
Yes.
to to
Yes.
um the effloresce, right? To come to full blossom. The word épanouissement captures it. He uses this Maritain to kind of explain this. Um yeah, what's interesting thinking of that, I don't know if you've read some of the things, but he's a Maritain connected person. We've at least invited him. He did a plenary for us a couple years ago. David Walsh, who used to be at Catholic University of America. They're
No.
republishing some of his works. I mean, he's an 80-some-year-old Irish professor.
Oh, yeah.
But some text on the liberal order, that Notre Dame Press just republished.
Oh,
That
okay.
there's a certain hermetic character to his writing, that, I mean, you sort of you're in his head, in his writing, but I don't know, I've been interested in revisiting it, and I would wonder if you in your own reading, you may benefit.
Oh, I'll definitely take a look at
Yeah,
that.
David
Yeah. No,
Walsh. It's in the
absolutely.
most recent catalog. He put a new intro on it. He's a quirky guy that, I mean, I liked him, meeting him. Good Irishman to have whiskey with. But all right, as we draw to a close, just in the interest of respecting time, listeners, not just our own. Um, so personalism had, at first, an uneven reception in the Catholic world, but it's kind of like St. John Paul II's papacy put that
Yes.
unevenness to a
Yes.
close.
Yes.
So, I mean, before that, but that initial period after the council, so up in the air that we weren't adjudicating that problem. There were other questions in the Catholic world. Um, you've hinted at, so this is a totally minored question now. The AMA has to deal with it, but I think it's important nonetheless because it tells us something about the standing worth of Berdyaev, right? If we think that Maritain has a kind of use in the Catholic world, and then also more broad Catholic personalism does, Berdyaev does have it's a weird position with regard to the orthodoxy. You're sort of doing something like what Marcus Plested tried to do in that recent book on wisdom for the sake of Bulgakov.
Right.
Right,
Right.
so
Yeah.
for listeners who are maybe not in on the Eastern stuff, Sergei Bulgakov was controversial in the Russian and then Francophone Russian scene because of positions of his tied up with sociology, etc. And so there's a period where Orthodox thinkers just entirely distanced themselves from any of this sort of style of Orthodox philosophizing and theologizing that you find an echo
Yeah.
in Berdyaev. And
Mm.
Marcus Plested, who's done work, our listeners may be more aware of his work on the Orthodox reception of Aquinas, but he had a volume
Oh,
recently
right, right,
on
right. Yeah.
sociology, and sort of trying to do a rehabilitation of Bulgakov. So I'm much more interested in like how much can the Orthodox world swallow? Because there are elements that are basically still present. You actually can't understand what's going on at St. Serge even after they start condemning Bulgakov. Even the stuff after that has all the echoes from that Russian context beforehand. All the themes of theurgy and the particular 20th century image and likeness of God, etc. All that just takes on new forms and is still present, and no matter what the form of Orthodox theology is. That's my opinion, looking as an Eastern Catholic. Um, that being said, there's a currency that's still there, and yet I think there would be a pushback from a certain kind of Orthodox.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
what are the promises of Berdyaev today? Promises and challenges. Tell us, what are the promises and challenges of like your world that you're fighting for?
Well, so, again, it depends on it. So this won't be controversial for your particular audience, but for the Orthodox world, I have made a very controversial point that really the neo-patristic turn, which for your listeners who don't maybe know about it.
This might be controversial for Eastern Catholicism. It's just about the same. So, just so you know,
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so George Florovsky in the 20s and 30s was originally a member of the Way magazine that Berdyaev put out. There's a wonderful correspondence between Berdyaev and Florovsky that's just been published in Russian. I'm hoping to get it translated into English, in which it shows that the two men collaborated. And then over time, in the 30s and 40s, they start to separate until the point. And there's we won't get into the whole controversy with Bulgakov, but Florovsky stands on the side of those who condemn Bulgakov for his sociological positions. And that's a whole story that is very complicated. But
mhm,
in the end, we see, and I have read Florovsky say that, this whole Berdyaev, Bulgakov, Shestov, the whole Russian religious philosophical tradition is a dead end. And really, the only way forward is through the fathers, right? So neo-patristics, rereading the church fathers, understanding the church fathers, and reinterpreting their ideas for the modern world. That's the narrative. I have made the controversial position that really what they did is they rebaptized that the neo-patristic scholars rebaptized the insights of the Russian religious philosophical world and made it neo-patristic. So, for example, if you read the works of Father Alexander Schmemann, amazing theologian,
mhm.
some really great stuff, For the Life of the World is riddled with, if I may use that term, uh, Russian religious philosophical ideas that he cannot acknowledge because those have become unsavory to a certain Orthodox population, right? So, in other words, theurgy, apophatic theology, right? The idea that God is nothingness, that we cannot access God directly, but through kind of a negative approach, right? Negative theology. That's Berdyaev, that's Bulgakov, and yet Vladimir Lossky takes it and he publishes it in his book, The Mystical Theology of the Orthodox Church, and now suddenly it's Lossky's contribution, right? And
Correct.
it's
Yeah, it's
not.
only Palimism. It's right or the fathers.
It's
It's
only
either
Palimism, and
neo-Palimism.
it's
Yeah,
only in the fathers, and we can skip a whole period. Here's the thing: what the neo-patristic scholars did is really interesting and really exciting.
yep.
But why ignore a part of your own tradition? Like, why decide that there's a whole part of your tradition you're not going to be a part of? It's one thing to say that both Bulgakov and Berdyaev went too far in certain things. And I'm very aware that in certain, that I can see why there are certain aspects of their thought that the Orthodox Church may find unacceptable. But you can say that, and then you can rehabilitate that which can be rehabilitated. I was very excited to learn that I was in the Orthodox Cathedral in Paris, the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in Paris, and I saw Bulgakov's works there in their library. So I'm thinking
It's a different.
the time has come. I
Yeah.
know that John Milbank, for example, has written on sociology as a promising way forward. So people are rediscovering sociology in different terms.
Mhm.
Not so. trying to avoid some of the pitfalls that Bulgakov fell into, while also rehabilitating some of the more fruitful aspects of sociological thought. For what it's worth, Berdyaev was not that interested in sociology. He actually criticized Bulgakov for that. So that's a point of difference between the two.
Sure.
Um, so anyway, my point is where to end with this. I think it's worth rediscovering these thinkers, not because we want to now canonize them and say, you know,
He has
these
the
are the
answer.
major.
Yeah,
What's
right.
that?
Yeah. We don't want to
Yeah.
just say he has
Here's
the
the
answer.
answer. Here's the new answer. Um, the word tradition is interesting, and I've given talks on this before. Like, what does it mean to have a tradition, right? Is it just the canonical works, and only you can read these works, and they must contain no controversial points because otherwise, or is tradition really an engagement with modernity in a variety of ways, some of which are true and some may end up being false? I mean, this was the original uh, thought of Hamyakov, uh, who was the sort of originator of the term subordinist, which entered into the Catholic tradition as well. I have evidence of that, right? The church is community. And he had this wonderful line where he said in the church's one, the church takes what's valuable and leaves behind what's heretical. And that's the way that the church moves. And I think that's the way we can approach tradition, right? There are things in there that we really need to grapple with and understand and engage with. And we can call out those things which we believe might be dangerous or even heretical. But we can't say this tradition is acceptable and this, even though we've borrowed from it, is not, if that makes sense. Christos Ianaras, right? Big figure in the Greek
Mm-hmm.
theological tradition. I read a passage by him, and I can't remember where now, where he said, when I read Berdyaev, I realized that Orthodox theology did not have to be the theology that I was raised with, but could be an entirely new thing. And it inspired me to become a theologian.
Mm-hmm.
We should know why that's true,
Yeah.
even if maybe we don't fully accept Berdyaev as
Yeah. We,
an
we don't,
Orthodox theologian.
because it's a certain kind of Phariseeism, and which, there's
Yes.
religious Phariseeism and natural Phariseeism, which the natural,
Yes.
just speaking philosophically, would just be not being, you know, genuinely engaged as a human in the midst of the messiness of the world, let alone that religiously, that refuses to let your tassels of your garment touch the world in which basically human spirit naturally and salvation history works itself out. And that's going to have a certain messiness. I had a relative who used to say to me, if I don't have a sense that I'm caught up in a certain kind of messiness, I wonder sometimes if I'm really, in his case, it was a very evangelical idiom, living the life of grace. So he probably said something a little bit different than that. But also too, that you're not just being genuine to what the human encounter of mind with reality is, let alone then, like I said, at the level
And
of
this is an argument I've used before, and I think it's just a truism, but it's worth repeating. If you look at, if you say, okay, back to the fathers, well, what did the fathers do? I mean, especially if you look at the Cappadocians, right? They took Platonism and they baptized it, right? They went, they knew the Socratic dialogues, they imitated the Socratic dialogues, and they used it, right? So they were not afraid to take what was valuable out of the kind of pagan context in which they found themselves and to leave behind what was not. And so why not imitate them in a similar way? Why not read anthroposophy and see what it is, that the insights that it has that we are lacking? And, that was it. Berdyaev, and this is why they call him he wrote this letter to Andrei Bely, the famous poet who's an anthroposophist, and he said, so much of what Steiner says is interesting. And I think he's absolutely right that we are obsessed with scientism and do not see spiritual realities. And then in his second letter, he said that, but the problem with Steiner is that there is no Christ, right? So he took what was interesting and thought-provoking, and he critiqued what he thought was erroneous and off the mark.
yeah.
I think we can all do that without saying, "No, we cannot read this. Yes, we can."
And it would be in
Well, at least
line with
there's some
the
things which we should not read. I do believe that's
Sure. No, no, that's fine. Yeah, that understood. But I mean, it's still the point that you're pushing back against is a certain historicism of the mind of the fathers, because it is precisely the mind of the fathers, which is sometimes pretty, I would swear, pretty darn messy. Think
Oh,
about
yeah.
those early apologists, right? If you
Yep.
want philosophical, like a buttoned-up Thomist system, like I've got my principles and conclusions scientifically connected to
Oh,
each other.
I know, yeah.
No, no. They just grab what's at hand in Hellenistic culture in service of Christ. Sometimes to the point like they themselves, their language has a kind of like subordinationist ring to it at times, right?
Yes,
Right. But it's,
yes.
it's clear that it's faith defending itself using what's at hand, and that's part of the mind of the fathers, right? It's not just a certain romantic. I hate golden age thinking. I mean, it's just insane to me. But that's a different podcast. I mean, we have a lot of similarities from different traditions with the two of us here. So I think we've convinced our listeners. I think you've ended it really well. So I want to not put too much snow on the bell. I'm going to let that just sort of ring. I mean, the engagement here is very fruitful. I want to assure listeners who might have some awareness that I'm an Eastern Catholic to know that this is not just because I'm an Eastern Catholic. I really I benefited from this text, and I've got all kinds of dog earring on the top and the bottom because I didn't have a pen on the plane when I first read it. And so that was
Right,
my way
right,
of kind of
right,
putting my notes
right.
together, was to bend it down to where the text was. But I really think like this is a great text for people to have. You will not fail to learn lots of interesting things about Maritain, but also just that context in which there's a lot of ferment. I want to thank you for taking time with us today. This is great, outside the bounds of what I think most Maritain people would like initially jump into. So, Anna, it has been a real pleasure.
I want to thank you for inviting me. This has been a delightful conversation. So I really enjoyed it. And I hope your listeners enjoyed it as much as we did.
Ah,
So,
at least it's that. So,
right,
and thank you to
right.
all of you for being here to listen to Maritain Musings. I've been Matthew Minard. Our audio and video editor is Hunter Olson, who helps us with each of these podcasts. If you ever have a thought of someone that you think who should talk about Maritain things, don't hesitate to reach out to the American Maritain Association and let us know. So, thank you again.
Thank you.